Welcome to Inspired Nonprofit Leadership, where you'll hear insights and useful strategies, as well as lessons learned from other nonprofit leaders and valuable tips from a variety of experts. Here to help you with the challenges and opportunities you face day after day is your host and nonprofit leadership expert, Sarah Olivieri.
Hello, nonprofit leaders, and welcome to your go-to place for information and inspiration to help you be even more effective. I'm your host, Sarah Olivieri, and you're listening to Inspired Nonprofit Leadership. I have a special guest today. It's Mary Hiland, the creator of this podcast, and Mary is also an expert in nonprofit board and leadership development. She is dedicated to assisting nonprofit executives lead effectively with their boards and to help each board member unleash their full potential for mission impact. She has over 4 decades of experience in the nonprofit sector, both as an executive director and as a board member. As an executive, she grew her nonprofit from just $100,000 annual budget to over $26 million and led 2 mergers. And she has been consulting and coaching for over 20 years. And she is just one of the most thoughtful folks in this sector that I have ever come across. And she's the author of the best-selling book, Love Your Board, The Executive Director's Guide to Discovering the Sources of Nonprofit Board Troubles and What to Do About Them. And today we're going to be talking specifically about the board chair and executive director relationship. So listen up and welcome, Mary. Before we hop into our topic, is there anything you'd like to share with our audience about yourself personally or your journey since you left the podcast?
Not specifically, but I just want to say you are doing a fabulous job. And I have actually gotten comments from listeners saying what a great job we did in our transition and that you are the perfect person to have stepped in behind me to carry this on. So I'm so grateful to have the legacy that you're carrying on work still and add so much value.
It has been such an honor to carry on this work, and I'm having a great time doing it. So let's dive into our topic.
Good.
Yeah, that is important, right? For all of our leaders out there.
It is important. You got to have fun, right?
So let's talk about something that is, I hear often, not so fun, the board chair executive director relationship. And maybe we can give some people some tips on how to make that better. But let's go in. What are the problems that you have seen over the years emerge around this relationship?
Well, I think the most obvious one is you just don't have the right person in that seat. I think very few nonprofits have criteria that they use to select a board chair. And the board chair characteristics that are so important are the ability to facilitate, the ability to motivate other board members, to create a team. And some of those characteristics really are those that also help make building the relationship with your board chair better. And people put very busy people into that role, and they don't have time to work with the executive. They don't even have time to build their relationship with the executive. It's just, okay, I'll run the meetings, but it's so much more than that I think that's the real challenge. And there are so many benefits to both the executive and the board chair and the board itself and the nonprofit when you have an effective board chair and when that relationship is really working. So it's disheartening to see there's not enough intention around this.
I've seen that a lot. I've seen a lot of boards struggle to find a chair, someone who's able to put in the time and has that skill set that you talked about. And then it just becomes whoever will do the job, whoever will run, or I've even seen just begging past chairs to stay because there's, no one else who wants to take over, or you let somebody take over who's maybe in it for the wrong reasons, because they're looking to kind of have a lot of influence over the organization, which isn't maybe what that role is supposed to be exactly.
No. Influence is good, but influence over the organization that comes from ego is not.
So let's talk about what are some, you've done, and let me preface this for everybody. Mary has done extensive research on this topic around what makes boards effective, and that relationship that we're talking about today. So what did some of that research reveal for you?
Well, thanks for asking about that. That was my doctoral dissertation, actually, the relationship between the chair of the board and the executive director. And of course, when you're doing doctoral research, you have to have some kind of theory. And so one of the questions I asked, I'll just preface with this, was how do we know when a relationship has value? And one of the things I discovered was something called social capital. Social capital is an asset you have by virtue of your relationships. And so what I was looking at specifically was, does the board chair executive, number one, what do they do when they spend time together? Do they spend time together? And then does that result in any benefit for the organization or the board itself or the individuals? So I interviewed individually and separately the board chair and the executive director of 16 pairs of active relationships. And the results of the research were that there were some behaviors that really made a difference on the positive impact. One of them was, what are you focusing on when you spend time together? And some of the pairs now, the executive and the board member, whether they were on the phone or whatever, it was just some kind of personal interaction. What do you focus on? And the pairs that had the least impact, positive impact, were focusing on internally on the organization, on the operations. The pairs that had the most impact were actually focusing not only on that, because sometimes you need to check in with your board chair about some challenge you have as an executive, but they were focusing on developing the board together, and they were outwardly focused on the community. And the board chair was more active in reaching out into the community, being that ambassador that we always want the board chair to be. So it was so interesting to me that as I'm hearing what everybody's doing, when I actually lined it up and looked at the impact that those board chairs and executives that were very focused outward had better board relationships and results, and better results for the organization. The other dimension was trust. Which was not so much how they're interacting together, but it was about behavior. There are behaviors that I found, 19 behaviors, trust-building behaviors, that the board chairs and or the executives were engaged in when they were interacting with each other. And those who had more diversity in those behaviors, not just doing one type of trust-building behavior, and did it more, were the ones with the strongest trust. And the strongest trust, I'll just say this and then pause before I say something, that I hadn't realized, and I developed this trust model out of it, was personal. It was what I call identification-based trust. And it was when the executive and the board chair didn't just know each other, but they identified with each other in some way. You could find something that you have personally in common. Those pairs were powerhouses for their nonprofits. They had high trust. They were focused externally, and those were the ones that were the most successful.
I'm wondering, can you give us some examples of some of the trust indicators? Or behaviors, trust behaviors. Yes.
Well, the
Yeah.
behaviors. Yes, the trust behaviors. Well, some are the obvious ones. There's, you do what you say you're going to do. You tell the truth. Those are all communication-based trust. But another type of trust that people don't think about is competence-based trust. And when the executive is perceived as highly competent in their role, it really helps build trust. You wouldn't hire a plumber to do your electrical work, right? So I always encourage executives when they want to build not just the board chair relationship, but with the board as a whole, be sure your board members know your background, your experience, your education. And if they weren't the ones that hired you, be sure every new board member knows that about you, because the more information they have, the higher their trust in your competence in your role is going to be. So that was one type of trust that I thought was not, people aren't always thinking about.
I think that's so important. I find myself talking with executive directors a lot about this concept. I don't about, your basic qualifications that you need to introduce people to, but whenever you bring something to the board, and the mistake that I see insecure board executives make, and often they're insecure because there isn't a good trust relationship there. They come in, instead of informing the board about a decision they've made, they bring it to the board as a question because they think that somehow that will help things. It actually makes it worse. But when we go through coaching about how to communicate a decision that you've made, we talk a lot about it. Without going into too much detail, explain how you arrived at that decision, right? State, we looked at 30 points. You don't have to go through what the 30 points were, or we surveyed our entire staff, or we considered 5 scenarios, and this was the best one. Because if you don't provide some trust building background for that, this wasn't just a whim decision, this was a well thought out decision.
Right.
Going into the details can be way too much, but just explain that there was a thorough process and give enough details about the process. But it's the same type of thing about, reassuring your board, bringing that trust by showing that this was a qualified decision to make and that you were qualified to make it.
Right. And you're showing your competence as a decision maker. And you're letting them know what your process was so they can have confidence in it. And, you don't necessarily have to do that every single time, but I think that's an excellent example of how you build trust with your board, and they're, knowing that you've made a good choice. So, and if you've got the right board members, they're not going to second guess you and require you to go into those 30 points.
That's such a good thing. Yeah, that is another problem, right? Then they're really second guessing you. I want to go back though and ask you about this, seems obvious, telling the truth. Because it struck me as you were saying that is both obviously lying promotes distrust. But I think when there isn't trust, people tend to maybe do things that are less truthful. Like, for example, I was coaching a board member on how to lead a meeting where they were going to lead the process and the meeting where they were going to ask another board member to resign. And they wanted to basically not tell the board member what the meeting was about and then start the board meeting with kind of a bunch of fluff. Basically, because they wanted to avoid telling this board member. And I said, no, you need to be clear. And it says in your bylaws, by the way, that you need to say what the board meeting is about and give them proper notice, and don't have any fluff. Cut right to the conversation. But in a way, that's a form of deception and lying that I think comes around because you don't have trust. You have more thoughts about that and how folks should be thinking about trust and communication?
Well, I think the point I made earlier about identification-based trust is that I'm dating myself, but people know if you've worked for 40 decades, you're older, right? So, we used to think that what was personal was not
Mm.
professional. You keep your personal lives out of your work. And of course, you don't want to be inappropriately personal, but you need to be confident enough as a leader to look for opportunities to share things about yourself with the board chair, with your board members too, for that matter. But it can start with you learning about them, getting to know them more personally. I'm doing some work and some research on board engagement. And one of the things that I found, it seems obvious, but getting to know your board members is really, really important so you can design the experiences that are going to keep them engaged. So I think to try and build this identification-based trust, you need to get to know each other better, but you also need to have the foundation. Trust is cumulative. So you start with what I call calculus-based trust. You go to work in the morning, you get in your car, you stay in your lane, you trust everybody else is going to stay in their lane, right? You don't know them, but you trust them. So then the next level of trust is knowledge-based trust. And this is where you get into all the experiences of telling the truth, communication, contractual trust. People honor what they say they're going to do. But then this third level, this identification-based trust, comes next. You can't have it at the get-go, but you can build up to it. So I think looking for opportunities to learn about your board members and your board chair specifically, and ask them how they're doing, how is their family, and share things appropriately about yours. So that's some behaviors you can do to build that to
Yeah,
that
and it
level.
makes me think of so often. I was just talking to somebody about social media, and we're talking about the importance of authenticity, right? And I think these days that
Right.
that line between personal and professional, it's about being your authentic, full self when you're in the room, because we don't trust people who are perfect, and do because it's not real, and
Right.
that's harder. It's harder to trust. You kind of talked a bit about
Right.
some of the things that contribute to a successful board chair, executive director relationship. What are some of the other factors that you think, in addition to trust, make that a successful relationship?
Well, I think first, your board chair has to do the job. That's part of the board chair side of being competent and building competent-based trust. And the most important part of that, as I said earlier, was facilitating the meetings, engaging the board members, um, but also partnering with the executive on, strategic direction, thinking things through so the decisions are going to be better. I think that the board chair really does need to step into that role. It's going to be really hard for the executive if they feel the board chair's absent or not competent to lead the board the way they
Yeah.
need to lead the board. And that's leadership, not
Yeah.
control and command, which is so
Yeah.
important.
I just wanna highlight that because I
And I
think
think
so
stepping in,
often
yeah,
we still, to this day, pair leadership with authority or controlling power,
yes,
and that skilled leadership is
yes,
not about that. And to be a leader of a group and a good facilitator is quite a significant skill set, I think, and not to be taken
there is,
lightly.
there is. Well, and there's other research that has shown, discovered 5 competencies that a really effective board chair has. And one is the relationship competencies, and that's where what we've been talking about would come in. The ability to be non-judgmental, though, and be humble and be that leader, in terms of the relationship skills. Commitment to action, being willing to be proactive and devote the time you need to do that with your executive. Another important competency is the ability to see the big picture. I just was on the phone with with a board chair and an incoming board chair and the executive. And one of the challenges they had, which to their credit, they're working on, is the board chair and board members just wanting to see all the detail, not really being comfortable staying at the big picture level, the strategic level. And so you got to be comfortable there because that's where you belong as the board chair. And another competency is willing to be creative, willing to be innovative. It isn't just about maintaining the status quo. It can be about what new thinking, what new perspectives are you bringing to the table? And you're modeling that for board members. And that's a really good characteristic for board members. And then finally, the fifth competency was the ability to influence, which we had talked about, but in a more negative way. You want to have a board chair who has connections in the community and is willing to use them. So that's one of the other criteria to be looking for when you're selecting a board chair. And I know this sounds like the board chair from heaven, which most people don't have, but it's worth inspiring.
Yeah, and I think there are many people out there who embody all these qualities, but maybe when they're really good, they're not going to be raising their hand first because they know. I mean, the flip side is, right, if you know what the job really entails, you might need to be courted a little more to be convinced to do it. But I think it's worth it, right? If you do that extra work, these people are out there. But it might be precisely because they know that this is a really kind of a big job. And a job that involves a lot of skills developed over a lot of time that are frankly usually in high demand. And they don't want to be, put that effort in not to be, for it not to feel very good or for it not to really be needed or taken advantage of. Just like courting any A player for your staff.
That's right. And I think that you bring up a really good point, Sarah, that it really is about recruitment. You need to be proactive in your board member recruitment. You need to be looking at every board member through the lens of leadership qualities, because you either want to develop them into that board chair candidate while they're serving on the board, or you want to recruit them in. There's nothing wrong after people get acquainted enough with your organization with having people step in early to that high-level leadership role or recruiting specifically for it, because it's very hard to get it. And when you do get it, you can always educate people about your mission, your field of service, who you are, but you can't educate these characteristics into somebody in a short period of time. You have to develop them over time. So recruiting for leadership is so important. And I'm not sure it's top of mind when people are looking for new
I
board
think,
members.
I've heard myself giving similar advice to executive directors for their staff. You should always be building a list of people you'd either like to hire someday or who are connected to people who you'd like to hire someday. This shouldn't be something that you're doing when there's a vacancy or an upcoming vacancy. You've got to, this is ongoing work. Related to that, I want to ask you a specific question. How do you feel about boards who are set up where they always have a vice chair who's like got a 4-year term and is basically then slated to be the next board chair? This is a dynamic that I've gone back and forth on a lot of times about it's good, it's bad, it's good, it's bad. It's, what are your thoughts about that?
Yeah. Well, first, let me clarify. When you say
A
4-year
term,
term,
an
what do
officer's
you
term that
mean?
might be they're voted in for a year or maybe it's 2 years, however long their officer term is, and I don't know why I threw out the number 4.
Okay.
But I'm glad that
Oh, okay,
it is a
because
long
that's a long
term.
time to be getting ready
Right.
to be president. Well, um, this is an interesting question, and it's close to my heart because I am currently the president-elect of
Mhm.
a board. And my experience in reading it, there's not a lot out there, is that this generally works really, really well. When I've talked to executives about their relationships, uh, in fact, in this one recently that I was talking to, the chair-elect was included in all our conversations in terms of the work I was doing with the board chair and the executive. I mean, it doesn't mean you have a threesome instead of a pair, but my personal opinion is that it is a good thing. Number one, you're doing succession planning on an ongoing basis. You've got a pipeline filled. You're not in that desperate situation to grab someone. And the chair elect has a chance to really learn from the current chair, and start building that relationship with the executive, because most board chairs that I'm aware of serve maybe a year and then they rotate off. But I think that's a big mistake. I think it should be at least 2 years. So your number 4 was not out of whack, where you'd be president-elect for 2 years and then you'd be chair or president or board chair, whatever you want to be called. But I think it's a great idea because any kind of mentoring or time, and you're also testing the person
Yeah.
out, but the risk is something happens in their lives and then they have to say, oh, by
Right.
the way, I
So what
can't do it
happens
now.
if
But
the 2 big problems I go back and forth on are, well, what happens then if they don't wanna be chair? And then the other one, which we kind of already addressed,
Mhm.
is you've gotta be careful about who you put in vice chair position. I think that was also even more prone because
Oh,
vice
yeah.
chair doesn't sound like full chair, and then you're, like, maybe extra I don't wanna say nonchalant, but you are, not giving it the care and diligence in making that decision of who should be vice chair, because it's not as gonna hit you
Right.
kind of
Right.
immediately, that you've gotta take care.
Now, I think you have to be very intentional. So, there are boards that have vice chair positions, but that's not the same thing as chair
Yeah.
elect. So I think you need to be very
Yeah.
explicit about that. And you don't want to automatically have vice chairs if you use that position, even. Vice chairs automatically be board
Yeah.
chairs, because there might be roles that a vice chair can
That's
have,
right.
like leading your strategic planning or, some other things that it might be appropriate for them to be in that role with that title, but they're not necessarily board chair
Yeah, I think
material,
it's
nor do they
interesting that you said,
want to
if you
be.
have a vice chair, in looking at the history of boards and what boards mean to us today, I think in the past, before we had such instant ability to communicate, boards needed a more robust officer slate to make decisions because it was hard to
Mhm.
assemble a full board. And I think now especially with Zoom, but really once telephone
Oh,
meetings
yeah.
came about, the need for such a robust full slate of officers kind of really is diminished because there's almost no
Right.
circumstance, barring a total communications apocalypse, that we can't reasonably assemble a majority plus of our boards to have a
That's right.
conversation or make a decision.
That's
And
right.
uh, so is that your
Right.
feeling too, that we
And
don't
that, of
need so
course,
many
yeah,
officers? Yeah.
I agree. I agree. And, it also brings up the issue of executive sessions and executive committees. Maybe not so much executive sessions, but, do you need an executive committee? Now, there's a lot out there, I'm sure you've seen it too, Sarah, that says nix your executive committee, get rid of that. And I think that if you're functioning as a surrogate board and making decisions, and then the rest of the board members feel disenfranchised, that's a big mistake. I don't think you need an executive committee that meets regularly. I mean, this is one less job the board chair has to have then. But I do think that my own experience was having an executive committee when I was CEO was very helpful, but they met with me. They were like a sounding board. I didn't have to convene the whole board for that. And they led my evaluation. So that group of officers can have a role, but they don't need to be meeting every single month or, they really don't need that kind of agenda.
I completely agree. Having put quite a bit of thought into it and modernizing some bylaws a couple times recently, I've come to the same conclusion. I like to think of the executive committee as like the board chairs and the executive directors committee of leaders on the board, right? That they can assemble for feedback or if there's discussion about what needs to be on the agenda or board management issues. If there's a board member that is causing challenges, it's helpful as a sounding board and completely should not be operating as a second board because that's just not necessary these days.
Well, and you don't need to delve into every item on your agenda ahead of time. I mean, and do that duplicative work. I mean, nobody has time for that anymore. That just doesn't make any sense.
So we're pretty much at time, but maybe we can wrap up with, if you would describe what you think that perfect executive director, board chair relationship and communication flow looks like so that we have something to aspire to.
Well, I'm not prescriptive, but I will say that number one, meet before the person steps into the board chair and talk very explicitly about how do you view your role? How do I view my role? So that you are on the same page. One of the board chairs in my study said it's not about job descriptions, it's about working it out together. And that is true. You really need to start with managing your expectations of each other by asking each other, what do you see yourself doing? What do you want to accomplish this year? How do we work together effectively? What are your communication preferences? How frequently? Agree on how often you're going to connect with each other, at least once a month, probably better every other week. A quick check-in, and what is the focus of what you're going to be doing together? And so the executive knows what he or she can bring as part of the agenda, and the board chair knows too what they want to pass by the executive. So I think it's all about being very proactive and designing your relationship together.
I love that. Well, Mary, for those folks who want to work with you around their board chairs and boards and being more effective and engaged, how should they get in touch with you, and who is the right kind of person who should get in touch with you?
Well, I'm working mostly nowadays with executives. Certainly a board chair can reach out to me, but I'm doing mostly work from the executive's perspective. How do I empower them and get them to step into a leadership role with the board because they have one? It isn't about the board. I know the board's your boss, but you can have influence and be a partner. I don't like to use that word because the authority is not equal, but you can be a real collaborative leader with your board. So I do want to work with executives primarily, have executive group, do coaching, but I will help with some training and coaching and mentoring of boards if that's needed. The best way to reach me, frankly, is to email me, which is mary@hilandconsulting.org, HILAND consulting.org. So you can find me. That's my website, hilandconsulting.org. So, just reach out, and anytime, I'll talk to anybody about anything, no charge, to see how I can help.
Well, thank you so much, Mary. It has been such a pleasure having you as a guest. And thank you out there for listening, but also for all that you do to make our communities better. This podcast is here for nonprofit leaders like you, executive directors, board members, in order to help you fulfill your full potential to advance the causes you care about so deeply. I've walked in your shoes as an executive director myself multiple times and board member multiple times. And now I'm here to offer guidance, encouragement, and practical tips to boost your organization's impact. To help you do that, in addition to the Inspired Nonprofit Leadership podcast, I have created the Inspired Nonprofit Leadership newsletter, where you can get weekly, bite-sized, actionable tips to help you run your organizations better. And you can access that at inspirednonprofitleadership.com/sign up. Before I sign off today, I highly encourage you to take a moment to leave a review for this show, as it helps other leaders like you find it. And you can just do that on whatever podcast platform you are listening on. Until next time, all the best.
You've been listening to Inspired Nonprofit Leadership. Thanks so much for tuning in. Be sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single episode or the bonus episodes. And while you're at it, please leave a rating and review, and be sure to share with your friends and colleagues. Tune in every week for more useful insights and wisdom on nonprofit leadership. Thanks so much for all you do for the communities you serve. Until next time, all the best.